Well, hello. My name is Henry Janowski. Uh, I started off at an entry level in public health in the state of Florida and spent my whole career in public health in Florida, just shy of 34 years. Uh, Went to Florida State University for undergraduate, University of Tennessee for a graduate degree, a master's in public health, and learned far more out there with my colleagues like Dr. Prather and Dr. Bigler and many more dedicated folks in public health. Well, it was actually kind of unusual because I went to Florida State, got an undergraduate degree in criminology with the hopes of having a career in law enforcement. And found out back then they could care less about an education in law enforcement. I was told when I went to interview they could take anybody off the street and make a policeman out of it. So that ended my pursuit of that. But I did have interest in Secret Service, and they said, yes, but you're going to move you all over the place, which I didn't want to do. And then this gentleman talked to me about working in public health and have investigative qualities to it. And that sounded interesting. So I actually took a position in, I think it was December of '67. And it was actually started with the Centers for Disease Control, but assigned to Florida. So it was essentially working for Florida, but just being paid by the CDC. And I worked for them for 2 years, and the state recruited me because I could stay in Florida since I'm a native Floridian, which is what I wanted to do. And I was married and had a new child, and I didn't want to move all over the place. So I started working for the Department of Health. I guess it was early on, it was the State Board of Health for a year or two there before it changed to the Department of Health. But started off in Fort Lauderdale and then moved to Pensacola. As it turned out, I ended up moving, I think, about 6 times in Florida. But anyway, went to Pensacola, and then some Dr. Prather and some others recruited me to come to the state office, which was then in Jacksonville. And I asked if I could go back to graduate school, which they helped me do, and got me to graduate school so I could come back and work with the Bureau of Preventable Disease, which Dr. Prather was working in, which I was looking forward to. But while I was in graduate school, Dr. Souter retired, and Dr. Prather took over as the state health officer. And so I missed working on a day-to-day basis with him anyway, which I was really looking forward to. But I came back with the Bureau with the goal of working in each of the programs. There was an immunization, STD, radiological health, and zoonotic diseases, veterinary public health. So those programs, I was to get experience in each of those so I could sort of fill in as they needed. And I did, and I really enjoyed that, learned a lot. Most of all, working with Dr. Bigler. I spent a lot of time with veterinary public health, and we did a lot of work with the St. Louis encephalitis that was at that time sort of a threat to Florida. And we were trying to track down what Bill hypothesis anyway, that migratory birds may be bringing in the virus and just sort of plopping down somewhere and then spreading the virus throughout the population here in Florida. So we spent a lot of time capturing and taking samples of blood from various populations of avian populations. In Jacksonville, we went out to parks and caught ducks and caught pigeons, and Bill had pauperized some flocks of pigeons that we would bleed on a regular basis looking for the presence of the virus. And then we had some interesting times setting up flocks, and which still exist today, of chickens, sentinel chickens, you may have heard from time to time. And I think Bill was the one that originally set those up on around the state, and he used to travel around and bleed them himself. And you haven't lived until you tried to bleed a chicken. That was fun. But then finally Bill got the various health departments to set up their own sentinel chicken flocks, and they would bleed them on a regular basis looking for the viruses. Never did locate any particular avian population that brought the virus down, but it was a lot of fun looking. Other than that, I got involved in brucellosis outbreaks over in Lafayette County. We had problems with psittacosis and psittacine birds being brought into South Florida without proper preventive medications. We were always on the lookout for dengue fever coming in with migrant workers, and malaria, which at that time we never had problems with. So that was a fun time. That was a real fun, interesting time, real down-to-earth public health and epidemiology, investigating outbreaks, shigellosis outbreaks. I remember looking in some lakes, the Naegleria fowleri that they have, and that is a killer that we really first got involved in, well, a number of years ago now, when people go swimming and stir up muddy bottoms of hot lakes. They get these forced up their nostrils, and it's a killer. So we got involved in things like that. We got involved in, unfortunately, outbreaks with raw oysters and Vibrio vinificus that turned out to be a problem and still is, and put out recommendations not to eat raw oysters, which people still do, and some people still love them but don't eat them. I spent about 10 years involved in those kinds of activities. That was really exciting and enjoyable. And then I was recruited into the immunization program, I guess, for almost 20 years as the bureau chief for immunization, which also turned out to be a very exciting time because it was a well-defined goal. You know, get children immunized, prevent problems in children, whether it was measles encephalitis or whether it was congenital rubella syndrome. Thank goodness we no longer had polio, but some of us are still old enough to remember when polio was a threat, and the iron lung, which used to scare people to get immunized, and we've unfortunately lost some of those fears in a good way. We don't have that problem anymore. But it appears that we're getting a little bit lax with measles. Measles is coming back. I noticed whooping cough is coming back. And I think it's because we don't have the kinds of problems that we used to have. And so we were fairly successful in reducing the incidence of disease and the incidence of serious sequelae as a result of those diseases. So that's one thing particularly that the legislature can be proud of in supporting public health, something that you can really see evidence of, because we've had such a significant reduction. And we've done that through getting our school children immunized, our 2-year-old population immunized, and now even the university folks immunized. And I worked with that for for 20 years, and feel real good about what we were able to accomplish in public health along those lines. I hope we don't lose that, because folks have become too complacent because they don't see what can happen if we don't prevent it, and it will. We're just an airplane ride away from some bad stuff if we don't get those levels of immunization up. I did work with Bill at Eglin Air Force Base, and we ended up, as a matter of fact, trapping coons and some possums literally outside the door of the doctors there that we were working with on the base, actually on the base. And yeah, and they had some reduction. We showed them how to live trap and have a reduction of the animal population to help curb the outbreak. Bill was a real expert when it came to especially raccoons. He also was an expert when it came to speciating bats, which there was also a problem with rabies. But the raccoons was the big thing in Florida, and we have such a huge population of raccoons, wild raccoons, and Bill did a lot of work in that, a lot, yeah. We had probably the reference you're making to, if I remember correctly, we had two, I believe, young women that came from Miami that were not immunized because of a medical exemption that was inappropriately issued. And they had acquired measles and then brought it to FSU. And we ended up immunizing, I think, about 20,000 students at FSU, which helped lead us to new regulations or rules in the university system. I worked with the Board of Regents and worked with the Council of Presidents to get the immunization rules implemented. And I don't think we've had problems since then. And the community colleges also jumped on board. So they're now appropriately immunized, and the administration, thank goodness, of the whole school system, including child care centers, have really jumped on board. And if you don't have the proper documentation of immunization, you don't get in. And that's what we needed for a long time. And it was actually something that was missing. That I can go back and recall that when I first got into immunization, we went out and did some assessments in schools. And I can recall finding 16 different kinds of documentation for immunization. Some of them were simply written on pieces of paper, on a piece of a calendar, I remember. Some of it was written by the parents and not issued by physicians. So we changed all that. We did away with all these different forms and came out with one form. And you had to have that one form, and it had to be properly filled out and properly signed, or you didn't get into school. It wasn't easy. A lot of people fought that, and it was a lot of trouble because we had to put a lot of people out of school that didn't have proper immunization, and we didn't make a whole lot of friends. I had a lot of nasty phone calls about the white horse that I rode into town on, who I think I was, trying to get all these kids thrown out of school and get them properly immunized. So it wasn't an easy time, but I think at this point it's working. exceedingly well. And our pediatricians around the state have been outstanding. The private medical community, in conjunction with public health, has been a really great relationship, and they've done a marvelous job. And I think we owe that to all of them. And I've got to tell you that public health nursing, I can remember, and I'm sure they don't do it the way they used to, but bless their hearts, I can remember some of these public health nurses, the mamas would bring their children in to get them immunized, and they couldn't stand to see their children stuck with a needle, and they would just say, "Here, nurse, give me a shot." And I've literally seen nurses wrestling children to the floor, one holding them and one giving them a shot so that they didn't leave there without the proper protection, while the mother just sort of cringed and stood aside. Some interesting times, some really interesting times, but they got the job done. They truly did, and public health nursing has done a marvelous job around this state, marvelous. Dr. Bigler and I got into a lot of unusual things. One that happened, this is while we were still in Jacksonville. Again, we were checking avian populations, bird populations, and we were licensed to do this. Bill was licensed to do this. And we went out to a big park there in Jacksonville, and you would popperize these birds. Pigeons was what we were looking for, and we would throw out a grain for them to eat, and we would cover it with a drug that would put them to sleep. And literally, you just put it down, they would come feed, and they would just sort of flop over. And you could come and bleed them, just sit them down, and then wake up and fly off. So we were doing this bright and early one morning, and had a whole bunch of pigeons and sparrows and other little birds early in the morning in this park on this sidewalk. And they had been eating the grain, and lo and behold, here comes a guy on a bicycle right through the birds. And they were not yet drunk enough to fall over, so they flew off half as drunk. So they were flying up in trees, and then they would just sort of fall out. And then lo and behold, here come a kindergarten class with the teacher. And the birds falling out of the trees, and the little children picking up the birds, and they would come over and ask us what was wrong with the little birds, and then we'd say, well, that's why we're here. We're out to get the little birds and check them and make sure that they're okay. So if you find any, just bring them to us. So they'd pick up the birds and bring them to us. So we salvaged the birds, and we got them bled and then turned them loose, and they flew away. But that turned out to be quite an interesting morning. But again, a challenge. Lots of challenges. I have, again, it's mostly what I see in reading the papers. And as I've said before, they have had an increase in whooping cough. And there has been some significant outbreaks in measles. I don't think Florida has not been one of them, thank goodness, but some of the states have. And unfortunately, if you take, you've got to have at least a 95% immunization level or higher in order to prevent an outbreak, because if you take a significant population and 5% of that is religious exemptions, or 5% of that is medical exemptions, then you've got a fairly significant population that could contract the disease. If you bring in measles from another country, and measles is an incredibly infectious disease, and you get in that kind of population, you can actually start an epidemic. And that makes me anxious when you have, because our populations are vulnerable, and we're just as far away as a plane ride. That's it. It can happen. It can happen. We got to keep our guards up. I want to see every child protected against vaccine preventable diseases. It's there. It's one of the best things that has ever been developed. It has prevented more disease, more serious complications, deaths, and it's as simple as immunization. I want to see every child protected. There's no reason why they shouldn't be. There's no need for them to die of measles encephalitis, or to have whooping cough, or to have a female that has a congenital rubella child. There's no reason for it. And we have been outstanding at preventing that. I'd hate to see that come back. We need to just continue to work and not let that population the population of unimmunized kids grow. We need to get everyone immunized.